Assalamu alaikum to Islam Unravelled, and I want to thank you for your anti-racism initiative and today's event around the hidden history of First Nations people. I think it's also very pertinent that today is this event is being held on the National Day to celebrate Indigenous culture, history, language, and I think that's incredibly important. The reality is that this is more than ever very pertinent given the recent horrible discovery of 215 kids in unmarked graves in Kamloops and the additional over 100 kids found in Manitoba. And sadly, we know that there will be more kids discovered because residential schools, and it's weird to call them schools because they were institutions designed to kill Indigenous kids, to strip them of their language, their identity, of who they are. I can only imagine the pain of families, of moms and dads who had their babies, their children stripped from them, these kids who lost all connection to their language and identity and then lost their lives in institutions designed to kill the Indian in the child and really to kill the child. So that is an important part of our history. We have to know this because it should inspire us to right the wrongs. Many of these harms continue to this day. It's an unbroken legacy of genocide and trauma, which means Indigenous communities are still suffering from the weight and the burden of this ongoing injustice. So acknowledging the history is the first part of healing, knowing what happened, and then we should all commit collectively to fighting for justice. Right now, as we speak, the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau is fighting Indigenous people in court, particularly Indigenous children who were found to have been recklessly and willfully discriminated by the Canadian government, by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, one of the highest tribunals in the land. The fact that the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau is fighting these kids in court is sheer hypocrisy when we have that same Prime Minister say on one hand that he is sorry about the horrible injustice when he is continuing that same legacy by fighting these kids who were discriminated by the Indigenous child welfare system. We know that the Truth and Reconciliation calls for action have been ignored. This government has been in power for 6 years and they failed to implement the vast majority of those calls to action, many of them which would actually have us walk the path of justice. So today's event is very important, and I want you to know as leader of the New Democratic Party, I will continue to use all the tools that I have, my platform, to fight for justice for the first people of this land, for Indigenous people, for First Nations, Inuit and Métis. They deserve justice. And as a starting point, implementing the calls to action, stop the fights against Indigenous kids in court and start walking the path of reconciliation with a true priority on making sure Indigenous people have access to clean drinking water, access to healthcare, equal funding, and a future that is based on a partnership where the federal government works in partnership, recognizing the inherent treaty rights, inherent rights of Indigenous people so that we can build a more prosperous, brighter future where Indigenous people are not subject to injustice, but walk the path of justice and freedom. That's a path that I want to walk, and I'm committed to making that happen. Thank you again for holding today's event. I'm honored to be able to share a couple words with you today. Thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum.